Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today we're going to talk about the Green New Deal, which is something I don't really know anything about. I was asking Jill, when did that start? I thought maybe a year or two ago, and she says no, that she thought AOC had started it about 5 years ago. So I was clued out for much too long. But the whole idea is there's green economics, and then there's something called the Green New Deal, which I gather is a global phenomenon that has not really taken off. Am I right? Anyway, we'll find out. I have two guys here who will tell us all about the Green New Deal. John Pfeffer is particularly one to talk about it because he has a project at his through his work organization specifically on the Green New Deal. John is the editor or chief honcho at the publication called Foreign Policy in Focus, which is an online publication at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., where he's been for a long time. But I knew him first in Prague, I think, where we met at meetings of the Helsinki Citizens Assembly back in the days of the ending days of the Cold War. And but so now he's on the board of directors of Project Save the World, and he's always good for a talk about economic matters and other things as well. And I understand he has a book out on the explaining the right wing movement globally. I'll give you a second to give us a capsule for that, John. So prepare your thoughts. And in Vancouver is Seth Klein, who was the founder of the British Columbia sector, anyway, of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And he ran it for over 2 decades. But he stepped aside 5 or 6 years ago because he was writing a book, which I thought was quite an interesting title, called The Good War. And the thesis of the book was that World War II showed how quickly a country, especially Canada, could mobilize and switch over the whole economy from producing cars and refrigerators and stuff to producing, warships and bombs and helmets and things. And it's quite an amazing thing how quickly we got out of the commercial industry into war production, and then how quickly we also returned to normality afterwards, because it didn't take that long to go back to commercial kinds of industries. So, and I will be joined here by my dear friend, Jill Carr Harris. Jill will be a co-host with me. She's kind of in training to be my successor. I don't know, neither of us really have the power to appoint her because the board of directors will do so. But I kind of think that'll happen because nobody else has any other good ideas. And I think Jill is an excellent choice. Jill is a Canadian who's lived in India for the past 40 years and has been doing Gandhian work, and involving constructive programs, which is sort of development work, as well as peace and reconciliation work. So with her husband, Raja Gopal, who's also a member of our board of directors. So we have a group here who either do know each other or all should get to know each other, and as many of you viewers should. So I want to say hello to Seth first, and I think I'm going to ask John. First of all, you do have an opportunity to talk about your book on the right wing, because I think this is very interesting. Give us a couple of minutes of your point of view about that, because it's the kind of thing I lie awake nights thinking about most. what the hell is going on? And did I do this? Did I cause all this problem? What did I do wrong? So, John, why don't you explain what you think has happened and brought us to this terrible state of affairs?
Sure. Well, I can talk a little bit about the book, but also connect it to the topic of our conversation today. Um, Basically, after the relatively surprising victory of Donald Trump in the 2016 election, we were all kind of taken aback by not only his capacity to um, rework the U.S. Political system, not obviously as thoroughly as he is doing now in his 2.0 version, but nevertheless, it was a concerning development. But we were also worried about his connections to especially far-right parties in Europe, his affinity for right-wing leaders in India, Narendra Modi, um, later the election of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and I would include in that number Vladimir Putin as well in Russia. And the question on the table was, are there connections among these political parties, leaders, movements beyond a certain affinity in their agendas? Was there actual concrete organizing among them? And was there an attempt to create what kind of far right activist Steve Bannon referred to as a kind of nationalist international? In other words, a group of far right leaders that coordinated their policies. And it turned out that there were attempts, especially by Steve Bannon, to rally the far right, especially within Europe and including Bolsonaro. But it turned out, too much to Bannon's chagrin, I suppose, that it's rather difficult to herd far right leaders and movements, that they actually do have considerable differences of opinion, particularly on, for instance, on Russia and on kind of social issues, socio-cultural issues. Nevertheless, there has been some considerable connections, and we've seen, for instance, in Trump 2.0, that the Trump forces now have really patterned much of their campaign here in the United States on what Viktor Orban successfully did in Hungary, what the Law and Justice Party attempted in Poland, a kind of illiberal platform that drew a lot from Vladimir Putin's own kind of version of illiberalism. So I wrote a book kind of looking at both the disparities, but also the overlap in organizing and agenda. And at the end of the book, and this was as a result of, about 100 interviews with folks around the world, I had asked people, well, is it Metta Spencer's fault that this has happened? Whose fault is it, and what can we do about it? And they said, well, it's not Metta Spencer's fault, so we will we will put that off the table. But we do have an opportunity, and the opportunity lies on the environmental question, because the far right, generally speaking, this was the case certainly 5 years ago, though it has changed somewhat. The far right really has no agenda on climate issues, has no approach to climate change other than to deny it. In other words, does not offer an alternative for folks who are worried about what's going to happen in their lives and in the lives of their children and grandchildren. And this should present an enormous opportunity for progressives who do have alternatives, especially when it's married to economic proposals, proposals that benefit, for instance, workers, benefit disadvantaged communities, and offers, a real vision of change for the future. And that is how one might describe a Green New Deal as it was put forward in the United States by AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Ed Markey in the House and Senate versions. It was a declarative rather, bill. It really did not mandate any changes. It was not connected to any actual policy, but it did lay out a kind of a program, an aspirational framework. And other countries have followed suit, and other political movements have followed suit. But I suppose in the next 45 minutes, we'll go into greater detail about how successful or unsuccessful those efforts have been.
Thank you. Okay, that brings me. Oh, you didn't give the title. What's the title?
Right Around the World, and I forget the subtitle, something like Organizing by the Far Right and the Left's Response.
Okay, very good.
I think it's so interesting that, John, you've got that, that you're drawing those connections between the rise of the far right and the role of a Green New Deal as a counter project. Just to weigh in, I think, and to place the Green New Deal in time, so to clarify off the top, it's not just 5 years old. I think John is right. It's the modern Green New Deal really has its beginnings in the lead up to the midterms in the first Trump presidency. And it was given legislative articulation by AOC and Ed Markey, but it wasn't just them, right? There were progressive think tanks in the states who were trying to spell out what it could and should look like. You had social movements like the Sunrise Movement in the states that was building up the mobilization behind it. And right away, you start getting interest here in Canada, in many places in Europe, start also digging into, well, what would a Green New Deal look like here? South Korea. I mean, the idea instantly starts finding some resonance. But where I'm intrigued by John's connections, so the Green New Deal has it finds its inspiration in the original New Deal of the 1930s. And like the original New Deal, it's taking a profound economic crisis and it's trying to figure out how do we meet that crisis with massive state-led public investments and offer people hope. And I think, when you look at the Depression years in the 30s, when you have that level of economic despair and unemployment, it can often go either way. In Germany, it went the way of Nazism. And in the United States, that same despair gave birth to the hope and promise of the New Deal under Roosevelt. There's nothing inherently different about Germans and Americans in that era. The leadership mattered, and the kind of explanations and alternatives that were put before people mattered. And I feel like we're very much in that same context today of a lot of despair and a lot of economic hardship. And you've got the far right forces trying to animate that and take people to this very dark place. And you've got other people in part using the Green New Deal as a way of offering a different path. Here in Canada, we never had a New Deal. We had in the 30s, we had Mackenzie King. Even though he was a liberal, he rejected following Roosevelt's path. Part of why in my book, so the full title of my book, Meta, is A Good War: Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. And I'm pulling lessons from the Second World War to say, what does it look like to transform an economy and apply it to the climate emergency? But the reason why I was latching on to the World War II story is because in Canada, we didn't have a New Deal. Like the climate movement in the States really had this historic anchor in the New Deal. For us, World War II was our New Deal. World War II was when we finally banished unemployment and saw state-led spending to finally put to rest the long tail of the Depression.
That I didn't know. And I wonder what would be the equivalent in World War II that did the trick. I mean, are you saying that there wasn't progress because you didn't have a Green New Deal or a New Deal?
I'm saying the Depression in Canada was longer and more stubborn because our government, we didn't have a Roosevelt-like New Deal. And it took the war for the pivot to occur. I mean, the commonality through all of these things is when do governments actually see emergencies as emergencies that require this level of leadership and intervention? And Roosevelt did some of that with the New Deal, and he created these new public institutions and all of these employment programs. For us in Canada, we didn't get that. For us, on the other hand, we joined the war 2 years earlier, so that's when it started for us.
Okay. Thank you for that. I didn't know.
The issue of the terminology of Green New Deal is really is interesting because most countries in the world didn't have a New Deal. So that language of New Deal, of Green New Deal, didn't necessarily find fertile soil outside of the United States. So, for instance, in Europe, they didn't call it a New Deal. They just called it the European Green Deal. The South Koreans did call it a Green New Deal, as far as I remember in the Korean. But interestingly enough, it was more a kind of repackaging of what the South Korean progressive agenda already was. It wasn't something that was especially radical or transformative. And indeed, much of it was reversed when conservatives took power in South Korea. But the real challenge was, I think, in the global South. And much of my work has been with partners in the global South. I mean, we've done programs on the Green New Deal or equivalent, legislation or packages in Europe, in India, and South Korea, in Russia, even in Russia prior to the invasion of Ukraine, when things really took a different turn, unfortunately. But a lot of the focus has been on global South, where the Green New Deal language was often perceived in a negative light, because there was a perception that, well, you in the North, you in the global North, are instituting these changes largely to benefit yourselves, to benefit your own economies, your own workers, and a lot of it will depend on us, on the resources in our part of the world. So it's fine and dandy that you've managed to knit together a kind of electoral coalition, shall we say, or a legislative coalition, or a movement coalition in the global North. But you're going to need our lithium. You're going to need our balsa wood for windmills. Well, they don't use it any longer, but that was the case for a while. Or cobalt, or rare earth elements, for the high-powered magnets. And it's not like you're proposing a new deal for us. And indeed, it kind of looks like an old deal from our point of view in the global South. It looks a lot like kind of neo-colonialism, in which you are trying to get our resources for the cheapest, in the cheapest way. And who will be left with the environmental bill to pay? Well, the extraction will take place largely in the global South, though, again, that's shifting a little bit. And the communities will, in our part of the world, will suffer the consequences of that extraction. And meanwhile, you will have your clean energy transition, and what will we have? It looks kind of dirty from our point of view here in the global South. So, we over the last few years, we've really tried to unpack what a Green New Deal looks like and how we can move toward a just energy transition that is fair both for folks in the global South and in the global North.
Right.
That seems to be part of your activities, that you spend a good part of your day organizing this project called the Green New Deal through the Institute for Policy Studies. And I know that you bring together people from the global South to talk about these matters. My impression, though, of course, is that it's, the Green New Deal is simply never taken off. Would you say that there's still, you must believe, I guess, that there's still hope for it in the global South, or you wouldn't be investing more of your time in it? Is that correct?
Well, yes, but I think Seth had something he wanted to add.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, John.
I mean, I do think that the general framework of marrying an attempt to address climate change with some economic content is vital. I mean, that's essentially the only way that you will get a large enough popular support to push such legislation through our Congresses and parliaments throughout the world. But the question, and this is a live conversation in Europe, much less in the United States, where unfortunately we're heading directly backwards under the Trump administration. But the question, for instance, of a carbon border adjustment mechanism or the terms of free trade agreements between Europe and countries in the global South, the terms of these initiatives are being worked out as we speak between countries in the global South and Europe. And it's a struggle. It's not like the Europeans are like, oh, well, we want to make this as just as possible for everybody, because the European Union also is largely looking after its own interests, not the interests of folks in the global South. The question is, well, where do we then have these conversations where the global South, a large number or a large portion of the population in the world, has a real voice and power that's commensurate with numbers in the global South. And that's the problem, because we really don't have international or global mechanisms at this point that really do level the playing field, if you will. Of course, we have the UNFCCC, which is, meeting in the Conference of Parties every year. And that's one place where countries in the global South attempt to, get money, for instance, or resources for mitigation, adaptation, and the like. But it's not a lot of money, and it's rarely coming when promised. And when it does come, it's often in the form of loans, which only adds to the indebtedness of countries in the global South. And what that leaves often are mechanisms which are clearly not committed to anything remotely resembling a Green New Deal, like BRICS, the BRICS formation: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus another 5 countries that have been added since they were originally formed, which is frankly committed to the same thing that Donald Trump is committed to, which is, producing as much fossil fuels as possible, and exporting them at prices that are beneficial for the exporting countries. And that's a problem. And when we're left at a global level with either ineffectual UN institutions or powerful but fossil fuel supporting institutions like BRICS, that's a problem for us when we're thinking about a global just transition.
Just to double back to your earlier point, Meta, I think you're right that the idea, the language and idea of the Green New Deal is not as prominent today as the first few years in which it was introduced. Although I think in its essence, it remains pretty attractive to a lot of people, and I don't think we've heard the end of it by a long shot. But I want to reinforce something John said. At its core, the idea of the Green New Deal is this linkage between tackling the climate emergency and tackling inequality and economic insecurity. The curse of the climate movement, I think, has been, and why it's made as little progress as it has for decades, is it's very technocratic, it's very professionalized. It's a lot of the so-called solutions are market-based. They're kind of impenetrable to the public, and often because of all of that, the right is successfully able to paint climate action as some sort of an elitist exercise that doesn't give a damn about working people and ordinary people. The rejoinder in the Green New Deal is this way of saying, let's make mobilizing on climate married to tackling inequality and poverty and housing. Anytime we're asking people to choose between the economic challenges and crises they face in the here and now and a climate emergency that feels a little bit in the distance still, even though that's less true with every day, they're going to pick this. They're going to pick their most immediate needs. And so the answer with the Green New Deal is to say, don't ask people to pick. Marry it all together in some. And the polling I commissioned when I was doing my book in Canada found, when you ask people about their appetite for bold climate action, it's actually remarkably strong across the country, including in petro state provinces like Alberta. But when you ask people, well, what happens to your interest and enthusiasm for bold climate action when we link it to increasing taxes on the wealthy and corporations and tackling inequality, the support for the bold climate action doesn't go down. It goes through the goddamn roof. That's the magic. And in its best forms, as John was saying, the articulation of a Green New Deal speaks to tackling inequality both domestically and internationally. That said, I think John's right that very often, when you go to the COP meetings of the UNCCC, last year's focused on loss and damages in the global South, but it tends to get very short shrift. It is always underfunded. That when it comes to building political support in the North, it tends to be the thing that gets the short end of the stick.
Okay, may I ask how you're going to marry these things together? In policy terms, isn't it pretty hard to do? Isn't it pretty much the case that that new climate change policies are going to cost, and somebody's going to pay for them, and it's also going to be poor people? And if you can give me some, formula for what particular changes are the most promising in merging these orientations and making them compatible, I will benefit as much as anybody else.
Well, let me go first on this one. So absolutely, it can be done. That is more or less what my book is about. When you look at what Biden did with the IRA, there's lots of critique I have to say about Biden, but I will say this to his credit, is when Biden talked about climate, he almost always made it about jobs in a way that in the Canadian context was rarely effectively done. And that's exactly what we should be doing. Again, part of why I was finding inspiration in the World War II story and applying it to climate is because part of what's interesting to me about the war is that at the very moment that we're mobilizing the whole country for war fighting, we're also introducing Canada's first major social programs. Unemployment insurance comes in the war. The family allowance comes in during the war. This famous Marsh Commission, kind of modeled on the Beveridge Commission in the UK, that lays the groundwork for the whole post-war welfare system, is written in the war. It's offered up to Canadians as this pledge and this promise that the country they will come back to will look different and be more fair and more equitable than the one they were leaving behind. That's when the mobilization happens. And that's where I think we take lessons for the present. It's tragic that we have wasted so much oxygen, political oxygen, making climate about carbon pricing. These market mechanisms where we're trying to incentivize change, it barely bends the curve. Nobody's going to go to the barricades to defend this thing. And it has inequitable impacts often, to your point. Whereas when you approach it like a war or like the original New Deal with a robust industrial policy, and it's where you do spend money, you spend what it takes to win, but You also introduce new taxes on the wealthy and on corporations, as we did in the war. We had an excess profits tax in the war. The kind of profiteering we've seen in recent years was illegal in the Second World War, and helped to raise a lot of money to pay for these things. In the Canadian context, in the war, one of the heroes of my book, much to my surprise, is this guy C.D. Howe, the Minister of Everything in World War II. This guy's kind of a right-wing cabinet minister in Mackenzie King's cabinet, but seized with the task. He creates 28 new crown corporations during World War II. Anytime the private sector couldn't quickly do what needed to be done, he creates another public corporation to do it. He's carefully coordinating supply chains to prioritize wartime production. That's how we need to approach the climate. An inventory of how many wind turbines and solar fields and electric buses and heat pumps we're going to need to electrify everything, and have a new generation of public corporations, which actually can make money, by the way, to mass produce and deploy these things and hire people. Like, again, this is World War II is when we banished unemployment. When we get serious about meeting the climate emergency, it's going to involve a lot of work for a lot of people. But we have yet to truly lean into the moment.
Yeah, I think your description, Seth, of an effective industrial policy is spot on. And we've only seen glimmers of it in various places around the world. And the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, was certainly one example. But within the federal policy of the Biden administration, there was another provision, another program, which I think bears a spotlight, and that is the Justice 40 initiative. And the Justice 40 initiative was a kind of mandate that the federal government allocate 40% of all money that was distributed on climate, on energy, clean energy programs, and affordable housing for disadvantaged communities. So this was a clear message that this industrial policy, however compromised it might have been under the Biden administration, was not going to be just an elite program. It was going to benefit communities that were disadvantaged, that had suffered the brunt of pollution and environmental contamination for decades, that it was in some sense a form of reparations. In fact, the United States has never really provided reparations for African American community, but Justice 40 was really, I would argue, the most important, the most effective program for reparations along the lines of climate and energy and housing that the United States has ever done. So naturally, on March 1st, Donald Trump canceled it. So unfortunately. But another point you've made, Seth, which I think is really important, is that this transcends partisan divides. There are so many folks you will find who are unlikely allies, and in fact, sometimes the leaders on these issues of addressing the climate problem. I mean, which state in the United States is number one in terms of production of wind power?
Texas.
You got it. Texas. It's Texas. And Texas is number two in terms of solar production. I mean, Texas, which is in everybody's mind associated with fossil fuel production and with right-wing politics. And yet it has, for obvious reasons, because the stuff is cheap to produce, has, and this is for over years. This isn't like just last year. This is over the course of 10 to 15 years, Texas has built up this capacity. Which part of Germany was the leader of its environmental movement, of its clean energy, of windmill production? It was Bavaria, the most conservative part of Germany. There are enormous opportunities to kind of do an end run around the usual partisan divide on climate and economic issues, to present something that is, I won't say transpartisan, but I would say post-partisan perhaps, in building political coalitions based on, on the facts, the facts of cheap energy, on the facts that we need jobs, stuff that folks, should look at and say, obviously, the facts dictate that we should go down this path, but also, has a vision and an excitement around it that people feel that they are part of something transformative. And this notion that climate policy is elite driven is something we really have to fight against. In Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland, the far right wing party, went from winning votes on the basis of castigating immigrants, immigrant bashing, to what was the issue that they used to be so successful in recent elections, both at the local level and at the parliamentary level. They organized against heat pumps against heat pumps, because they said that the German government is going to force people to spend a lot of money to convert to heat pumps, which wasn't correct. And they
Right.
also misrepresented the cost of heat pumps, but it got people frightened. And they used the same kind of fear tactics that they'd used against immigrants to portray climate activists, climate policy as taking money away from hardworking people and shifting those resources into the pockets of the elite. Again, an inaccurate description, but it's something that we, with a Green New Deal, or however we call it, we have to use it as an arrow, if you will, to drive right through that argument and destroy it, because it's a fallacious argument, and we can win with our ideas in the political marketplace, so to speak.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is no question. That's part of what we've wrestled with, is a shift where not that long ago, climate was not a political partisan wedge issue the way it has become weaponized by the far right in more recent years. I mean, the first UN climate meeting was hosted here in Canada under Mulroney. And when you look at which countries have, at least of the G7 countries that have been most successful in reducing emissions since 1990, it is Germany and the UK, a lot of it under conservative governments. But those days are over. It has become highly weaponized as a wedge issue now. Interestingly, just to play with this historic reference again, one of the most memorable things that happened under the original New Deal under Roosevelt was the Civilian Conservation Corps, that built this whole legacy of public parks and so on. And so Biden, under pressure from Sunrise, created this Civilian Climate Corps. Sadly, in his last year in office, so it kind of got stood up, and then Trump destroyed it. Here in Canada, we have been so I now work with something called the Climate Emergency Unit, and we've been campaigning the last 2 years on the idea of a youth climate corps, which is what borrowed again from Sunrise. And this idea that, again, we should make a generational invitation to young people. If you get this moment, here is a call to serve, to roll up your sleeve, help us meet, confront these emergency events, drive down emissions. When we poll on it, it is incredibly popular. But most interesting to me, because I follow climate polls in Canada very closely, mostly you find in climate polling that support for climate action is always higher among women than men. But on the Youth Climate Corps, it's the only poll I've ever seen where the enthusiasm among young men outstrips young women. The very demographic group where the far right is finding its base here and in Europe and in Trump's America also likes the sound of this invitation. There's something in that call to kind of just get it done and roll up your sleeves and meet the moment.
You know what that reminds me of? James, not William James, but the guy who was a pacifist, but he believed that
William James,
was it?
the philosopher William James, the moral equivalent of war.
Right. Well, exactly. That's what I was thinking. He was saying that young men need this experience. I guess he was thinking of, the outlet for testosterone or something. They need to go out and test their strength and their stamina and their guts, And so war had that effect. And so he wanted to create a war against nature. In those days, that was a more saleable thing than a war for nature. But he actually was going to have young men mobilized to go out and do what we would call very destructive environmental things, but do it collectively as sort of a team, as an experience to give their masculinity some sort of outlet.
Well, I quote James at the beginning of my book. Yeah, he talked about what is it that can animate the civic spirit in a similar way as young men have been animated by a warlike spirit.
Yeah. Well, and I think the CCC did that. I never heard of a female being in a CCC camp. When I was a kid,
There were some.
Those camps were very real, and because I'm going to be 94, so I remember things that you guys wouldn't, things that went on during the Depression, and the CCC, as far as I know, was all male, so no wonder.
It was mostly male. There were actually, but it was highly gendered in terms of what people did.
Okay. Sorry, I interrupted you, but I couldn't help thinking that the gendered aspect to it isn't just a momentary thing. It probably has some durability in terms of the way people think about what male roles should be. And
it isn't even just men or even just young people. I mean, this is my point, to bring it back to the Green New Deal idea. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago talking, I won't name the person, but talking to a senior politician in Canada who gets climate, and who was responsible for some climate programs, and saying to him, I know you get climate. I appreciate your efforts, but I don't hear you inviting your fellow citizens to join you in a grand undertaking. And we haven't.
I agree that the demographic of young men proved critical for Trump's victory in the last election. And there was even kind of crossover from folks who, the so-called Bernie bro, or the young men who supported Bernie Sanders, who switched over to support Trump. And their desire was, they felt that the status quo was unacceptable. Their job prospects, not great. The economy, who knows where it was heading. And to a certain extent, a desire to destroy the system in order to, regardless what would happen next, but just to see the current system be destroyed by some anarchic agent. I think they saw Bernie Sanders as potentially someone who could do that, but I think they also saw Donald Trump as even more anarchic. I'm not talking about what they are or not. I'm just talking about the perceptions of young men in the United States, and this desire for system transformation is not unique in the United States. I mean, obviously, a lot of the support for the far right in Europe came from traditional left-wing sources. The Communist Party in France, the Communist Party in Italy yielded up many of its members to the far right in elections, which was mortifying to the left. And, but you saw that the far right was offering an economic program that appealed to them. In some cases, it was stolen directly from the left. If you look at the Law and Justice Party in Poland, it had a left populist economic program, even though which they married to a far right social and foreign policy approach. But you saw it in other far right parties as well, a rejection of this so-called neoliberal economic model, both at a domestic and an international level. And the far right was really the force that was critiquing the mainstream far more than the left. And indeed, in many cases, the left was complicit in neoliberalism and the spread of neoliberalism in a variety of different governments, whether we're talking about Clinton, Obama, or Labour government in the UK, or even the socialists in France. And so the far right was able to say, look, we are different. We are going to give you something that you've never seen before. And in this day and age of rapidly changing headlines and social media expectations of change every 10 seconds, a lot of the electorate is eager for change and significant change. And if the left or progressives are just going to say, well, we're going to tinker around at the edges, or we kind of like what we had in the past and we'll change it a little bit. If they're not going to offer something equally transformative, as I think Bernie Sanders to a certain extent did, then young people, and especially young men, are going to say, no, thank you. We are going to look elsewhere.
I so agree with that. I mean, what the lesson that keeps getting made clear over and over again is that when we meet these very real crises with neoliberal incrementalism, we will never get ahead of the curve. We aren't actually solving the very real problems people face. And we are just either seeing the election of far-right parties or narrowly avoiding it and biding our time. On the flip side, just to offer a counterexample to what, or not a counterexample, but example of things moving the other way to what John just described. Look at the Democratic primary in New York City that everyone's talking about, where and the win by Zoran Mandami. So here are demographic groups and boroughs that just 6 months ago voted for Donald Trump, now voting for a Democratic socialist. Why? He is not a neoliberal incrementalist. He is also a populist. He is offering bold answers to people's affordability, the affordability crisis that people are facing, and he has some climate cred. So he's saying we need to transform people's homes, but we're going to have a rent freeze, so you're not going to wear it. He's saying we should have free public transit, which is of course vital for the climate transformation. So, I think there's important lessons to be learned there. That's what it looks like when you have a Green New Deal inspired, I would describe him that way, a Green New Deal inspired populist message that centers the affordability crisis and offers climate solutions in that context. And it works. And it can work with the very people who sometimes have recently voted for people like Trump, which speaks to the fact that, and to bring this back to the point I was making initially about people in the 1930s, so often we are in a complicated mix of virtues and vices, and our politics are confusing and contradictory. And in the face of these crises, we can get pulled in a way that animates our worst selves or animates our best selves. And both are very much in play at the moment and all over the world.
This thing about gender, let me ask you about that. Is besides Poland, is there any other place, or have you done any comparisons to see whether the attraction to young males is cross-cultural? That the right wing is attracting young males now for the first time. And do you know anything about how widespread that is? It's certainly clear in the U.S. and very frightening to me. But is it true generally in the world?
Well, I'll leave the question of Jordan Peterson and the Canadian experience to Seth. We could perhaps talk about that. But the appeal of the far right to young men in particular, though not exclusively young men, but certainly men, is pretty much cross-cultural, because the illiberal agenda is all about kind of reinforcing traditional gender roles and traditional gender relationships, and in some cases, pushing kind of the social norms back a generation in terms of how women are treated. Law and Justice and other parties in Europe, not all right-wing parties, but many. I mean, for instance, the far-right party in France is somewhat different since it's been led by Marine Le Pen, and she put her own imprint on it and her own experience around abortion. But a lot of it is anti-abortion. A lot of it is very traditional religious programming, if you will, or religious inspired roles for folks in society. So yes, I mean, this is pretty consistent, I would say, across societies. Unfortunately, because of this, you could attribute it to a backlash. Much of this is backlash against movements in general for civil rights for groups across the board over the last 50 years. So women's movement, civil rights movement for African Americans, movement for immigrant rights, movement for LGBT rights. So the expansion of the franchise and the expansion of rights discourse to include ever larger numbers of people has threatened men in particular, and obviously in countries where there are white majorities or even sizable white minorities, white men in particular. So that is definitely a key component in the success, unfortunately, of the far right.
What I'm wondering, you mentioned this successful Mandami, and I bet there are no polls yet, but would the polls show that trend, that masculine orientation to the right, has been overcome by his new way of campaigning?
Well, we don't know yet, and he hasn't been elected mayor. But there's hopeful stuff there. And again, and as John says, it's not just young people. I mean, and not just men. I mean, I think this was part of the appeal of AOC when she won her nomination and dethroned an establishment centrist Democrat, and obviously part of the appeal of Bernie Sanders as well. I just want to come back to your question, your previous question, Meta. I mean, I don't track this stuff internationally, although I have read research recently that points to the fact that if you look at these far-right manifestos globally, including the manifestos of sort of mass killers, misogyny is a common thread through them. In the Canadian context, remember, one of the longstanding prominent pollsters in Canada is this guy, Frank Graves, from Ecos Research. And I remember listening to a podcast with him last summer where, part of the interesting thing about Frank Graves is he's been at this for 40 years and asking some of the same questions throughout that time. And what he was saying is, I don't want to get too gendered essentialist about this, but what he was saying is, when you poll on political values, not partisan stuff, but political values, as he's been doing for many decades, he's never seen a time in which there was a bigger gap between young men and young women. He was kind of joking that there's never been a worse time to be a young heterosexual in the dating scene. Just such different worlds. Some of that is also about the disinformation era in which we live and how that intersects with social media. Again, not to get too gendered about this, but young men and young women are not, by and large, on the same social media platforms. Young women tend to be more on Instagram, for example, which is owned by Meta, the other Meta, which doesn't carry Canadian news, of course, which is a problem. But doesn't have as much disinformation as YouTube, which is where young men are. And to bring this to one of the names that John just mentioned, I mean, the algorithms on YouTube are vicious, and if you're a young man on YouTube, you are almost always 2 clicks away from a Jordan Peterson video. So in an era in which young people simply do not get news the way most of us are accustomed to. There are young women on Instagram who simply aren't getting Canadian news.
I should not deflect this too much into what my own preoccupation is, but I am just lately obsessed with the changes going on in YouTube within the last couple of months. It has gotten way worse, and they are doing disinformation unbelievably. They are doctoring videos so that they look real when they're absolutely fraudulent. And the whole level. I watch a lot of YouTube. And the quality has gone to the dogs just the last 2 or 3 months. I don't know why, but it's true.
So that's part of what we're up against. And, in that conspiracy disinformation realm, the focus of their attention shifts over time. So, we saw in COVID, it was all about, vaccine disinformation, and that has almost entirely shifted to climate, including in the focus of Jordan Peterson and people like that.
Didn't know that about Jordan Peterson. I liked him at the beginning. I even wrote a note to him saying I wanted to meet him. Way early, like 20 years ago. Anyway, sorry. John.
Well, to this question of what is our offer and invitation to young people, I would say this, and I only very loosely pay attention to him, but it strikes me, there's a lot of awful stuff in the manosphere online that young men are watching that's just inviting them to truly be their worst misogynist selves. But Jordan Peterson isn't that. It strikes me that a lot of the young people going to him are, in fact, young men looking for advice about how to live a good life.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's just that his advice is terrible. But I want to hold on to the first part of that, which is, again, you've got these young people searching. They know things aren't right. They're looking for meaning. And, my critique of my fellow climate movement is we have been boring these people with technocratic solutions that are market-based, unconvincing, incremental, impenetrable, when we should have been offering up new Green Deal-like solutions that are captivating and hopeful and exciting.
Okay, focus on that. We just have a few minutes left, and I would love to see more about the specifics of how you intend to make this attractive while at the same time an effective campaign for climate.
Well, okay, I'll go first and then John. I would just say it's what we've already started. The Youth Climate Corps offering to say to everyone under 35, if you want to meet this moment, you want to spend 2 years getting trained up in the key skills we're going to need to meet this moment, we have a place for you. Nobody will be turned away. We want to pay for a bunch of that with windfall profit taxes on the corporations that have been profiteering through this affordability crisis, and on wealth taxes, just like we did on the war. That's how we'll pay for it. Speak to people's affordability challenges by saying enough of the, carbon pricing and incentivizing. You want a free heat pump? Here's a free heat pump. You want to have free public transit? We're going to have free public transit. These ideas needn't be complicated. And we start there.
Sounds good to me. John?
I vote for that. I think there are a couple of challenges. One is we are boring often when we are talking about these issues, and we have to be joyful. Now, I know that's hard to do in an era of doom scrolling when everything seems to be leading towards apocalypse, but it's necessary to suspend our disbelief, as we often said in literary criticism, to suspend our disbelief for a moment in order to be joyful in our politicking and in our movement building. You want, as a person who is unaffiliated, you want to join something that is hopeful, that is fun, and politics seems to have leached all of the fun out of it. I mean, I think a lot of people like Donald Trump because he was quote unquote fun. I mean, I didn't think he was fun, but anyway, they thought he was fun. He would tell jokes that were stupid. He would say things off the top of his head that were stupid, but there was an element of unpredictability. And so to a certain extent, unpredictability meant fun in their eyes, at least when it came to politics. Well, I think we can be responsibly fun. I think we can have parties, we can have music, we can have all sorts of cultural events as part of movements. The problem often is that when we go from, the campaigning mode to the actual governing mode, it's like, okay, now we have to be serious. But that's a mistake. I think a mistake. I think as if we get to a point when we can govern, we have to preserve that fun element somehow as well. And how we do that? Well, again, money has to be allocated for joyful things. It could be, celebrations of victory, celebrations of policy wins. It can be also important making sure we celebrate those wins because so often they're not celebrated. And so, for instance, a lot of the things that the Biden administration did successfully do, no one even knew they did them. It was like, it was an absence in the media sphere. And I don't know if it was because they didn't have enough time. I doubt it's because they were modest about things, but it was absolutely critical. I mean, the European Union does a very good job of putting up a big billboard whenever any money is allocated for something anywhere within the European Union. European dollars went to the renovation of this, playground or this church or whatever, so that people know, my money is going to something important. So those two things, kind of the element of joy and the element of celebrating our policy wins, I think are absolutely critical, not only for getting into power, but for maintaining ourselves in power.
Well, hooray for you. That sounds very bracing and inspiring and makes me feel like running around the block. So thank you, guys. This has been fun. And I really, I don't know how much progress you're going to make with this, but I'm all in favor of it. So keep up the good work, and we'll talk about it again another year or so and see how you've done. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to do this with you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.